So thank you for joining us for this webinar this lunchtime. So this is part of the Rediscovering the River Colne programme, which was funded by Watford Borough Council to connect local people of Watford with their local river, which is the River Colne, and that's through a variety of community engagement initiatives and environmental monitoring as well. So a few house rules: please remain on mute throughout the webinar. Please put your questions in the chat function though during, so you don't forget. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A and you can ask or have your questions answered then. But I will now hand over to Rose to lead this webinar.
Thanks, Emily, and yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk about this subject. Going to share my screen. Oh, has that shared properly? Can you see that, Emily? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So my name is Rosemary Perkins. I'm a veterinary surgeon and a doctoral researcher at the University of Sussex. I'll be discussing what we know about the environmental impact of parasiticides used in topical pet medicines. So just to define these terms, parasiticide is a substance used in medicine or veterinary medicine to kill parasites. A topical pet medicine is one of those that's applied externally to the skin. And in veterinary medicine, these are mostly spot-on products, but they can also come in the form of collars or occasionally in sprays. So I'll be talking about two particular topical parasiticides called fipronil and imidacloprid, which I'll come to shortly. These are the subject of my research and are two of the most widely used parasiticides. So I'll be looking at what we know and what we don't know and talking about some of my research as well. So just to give a bit of context to this talk, you've probably heard that we're facing really concerning insect declines around the world. The graph in the top right-hand corner of the slide is just a snapshot from quite a famous study from Germany published in 2017. And they measured the weight of flying insects caught in traps in German nature reserves over a period of 27 years. And you can see a very clear downward trend there. And they calculated a 75% decrease in the biomass of insects caught in these traps over that period. And there are multiple other studies showing similar trends to a greater or less extent from all around the world. So this is very concerning. Insects and invertebrates in general play a number of essential roles, so pollination of our crops, recycling of organic matter, and they provide food for other creatures further up the food chain. So they are pretty fundamental to life on Earth. So there are multiple causes for these declines. We know that habitat loss is a major contributor. It's thought that pesticides are one of the main contributors to these declines as well. So this is just a quote from a well-known biologist, E.O. Wilson, which my supervisor, Dave Golson, quite likes to quote. So he said, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. So moving on to the topic of this talk, what do we know about the impact of pesticides used in companion animals? So the first thing to point out here is that the terms pesticide and parasiticide can be used quite interchangeably here. So a parasiticide is a particular type or subcategory of pesticide. And I think this does sometimes come as a bit of a surprise to pet owners, as it's not always made clear that these products are not necessarily benign. So for example, fipronil and imidacloprid, which I'll be focusing on next, have been very widely used as agricultural pesticides, and there has been a lot of concern around their environmental impact. So coming back to what we know about pet parasiticides, there are a number of significant knowledge gaps in this area. And I think it's fair to say it's a very much a neglected research area and arguably has really flown under the radar for a long time. And there are a number of reasons for this. So firstly, in comparison to the environmental risk assessment required for parasiticides used in livestock, there's a really limited assessment required for veterinary medicines used in non-food animals. So basically the assumption has been that the amounts used are too small to have any significant impact. And they're also sort of applied to individual animals, not just whole herds of animals. So very little information is required before they're approved for use. And I speak to quite a lot of pet owners, and often the response I get when I've mentioned the subject is a surprise, as it's something people haven't usually thought about before. And when they do think about it, quite often they'll say that it sort of never occurred to them because the amount seems to be so small. It's quite counterintuitive that it might be having an impact. But if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, we know that there are a large number of pets in the UK, so over 20 million cats and dogs, and a large proportion of them receive regular worming and flea treatment. And what we call blanket prophylaxis, which is continuous year-round preventative treatment of all pets, is still quite widely recommended for fleas by product manufacturers and also many veterinary professionals. As I'll come to later, the ingredients in these products are very potent, which is why they are effective. And unfortunately, as a general rule, effective parasiticides aren't only toxic to target parasites, but do affect a wide range of other invertebrate species as well. And if they enter the environment, they do have the potential to cause harm. So recent studies have looked at this and raised concerns about the potential consequences. So before I go into that, I'm just going to talk a bit about these two compounds, imidacloprid and fipronil. So imidacloprid is in a class of pesticide known as a neonicotinoid, and they've become quite notorious for the environmental risks they pose. Fipronil isn't a neonicotinoid, but it has a lot of properties in common with imidacloprid. So they're both neurotoxins and extremely potent pesticides. They're very toxic to a wide range of invertebrates. They're very persistent in the environment. And they're also fairly water soluble, which means they're quite mobile in the environment, and they have the potential to pass to waterways. And they are selective for invertebrates, so are considered to pose a lower risk to vertebrates such as mammals and birds. Although there are some studies showing that they can have effects on some vertebrate species, but that they're generally not considered harmful to pets or people. Fipronil degrades into fipronil sulfone and fipronil sulfide, which are also extremely toxic and more toxic to some species than fipronil itself. And fipronil and imidacloprid are the two most common active ingredients in topical pet flea products in the UK. So fipronil covers ticks as well as fleas, just to note that. Just to give an idea of their other uses, they're used in three main categories. So as plant protection products, mostly in agriculture. Secondly, as what we call biocidal products. So these are products that kill ants, cockroaches, and flies, so mostly in baits. And thirdly is veterinary medicinal products. Imidacloprid has a history of widespread agricultural use. In fact, at one point, it was the most widely used agricultural pesticide in the world. However, it was banned for outdoor agricultural use in 2018 in the EU and the UK due to the risks it poses to non-target insects. But it had fairly limited use in the years running up to that because of these concerns. And fipronil has a history of really limited agricultural use in the UK, so pretty much negligible use. And it has been completely banned as a plant protection product. So veterinary medicinal products, these ingredients are only licensed for use in companion animals, not in livestock. So there are a whole range of different brands containing them, but these are some of the most well-known ones. You may recognize some of these products. And most recent sales data that we have indicates around 4 tons of imidacloprid is sold in these products in the UK every year, and 1.5 tons of fipronil. And that's just the pure active ingredients. So these are pretty substantial quantities. So following application to pets, they spread over the surface of the skin and are slowly released through hair follicles. And the spot-on formulations generally provide protection against fleas for about a month. We know that they are dispersed into the environment through pet hair, through shed skin, and direct transfer. And just to give an idea of how potent they are, one spot-on for a medium-sized dog contains enough imidacloprid to kill approximately 30 million bees, which is about a truckload of bees, so they are just incredibly potent. So having said that, we know little about the environmental impacts of parasiticides used in pets. Over the last few years, a number of studies have raised concerns about this. A couple of studies came out from California, and the first one found really concerning levels of fipronil and imidacloprid in wastewater, so coming from sewage treatment works and originating from down the drain sources. And this was quite a new finding, which no one had really looked at before. They investigated potential sources and implicated topical pet flea products as a potentially important source of this pollution. And they also found that very little is removed through the treatment process. So most of it just flows through the treatment plant and on into rivers. And as a result of this, another study was published in 2017 from Jennifer Tierlink, which confirmed the pathway for fipronil from treated pets to waterways through the bathing of treated dogs and measuring the amount of fipronil that came off in bath water. And they found that a substantial proportion of the amount that had been applied to dogs washed off when they were bathed. So extrapolating this across the pet population, looking at flea product sales data, they calculated that just bathing of treated dogs could in theory account for all of the pollution that was seen in wastewater. And this was just looking at one potential pathway. So this didn't establish that flea products were the primary source of the pollution, and they didn't establish what proportion was coming from flea products. So they didn't look at how often people bath their dogs, but it did confirm one of the pathways from pets to waterways and suggests that this may be an important source of pollution. So this report from the Netherlands did some initial calculations, and they found that even if tiny fractions of the amount applied to the pet population enters waterways, this would pose a risk. So they calculated that if more than 0.01% of fipronil and 1.15% of imidacloprid passed to waterways from the pet population, this would exceed environmental thresholds. So this brings me to our paper. We looked at Environment Agency monitoring data in English freshwaters from 2016 to 2018. We looked at levels of fipronil and imidacloprid in over 3,000 samples from 20 English rivers, and we looked at levels of pollution and potential sources of the pollution. So we found really widespread contamination of rivers with these chemicals and frequently occurring above recognized safe thresholds. Fipronil was found in 99% of samples. Imidacloprid was detected in 66% of samples. And we found that fipronil's toxic degradates pose the greatest environmental risk. This map shows the sample site locations for fipronil and fipronil sulfone. Both of these compounds were detected in all of the sites that were sampled for them. The yellow sites indicate where they were detected, but the average value was below the environmental threshold. The orange and red sites indicate where the mean value exceeded toxicity limits. And then interestingly, because we were looking for potential sources of the pollution, we found that the highest levels occurred immediately downstream of wastewater treatment works, which suggests that this may be an important source of pollution. And it's consistent with the findings from the studies in California. So what is the evidence that the pollution in UK rivers is causing harm? So there aren't any specific studies looking at the effect of these chemicals on aquatic communities in British surface waters, but we know from other studies around the world that the measured levels are likely to be having an impact. So for example, large-scale studies from the Netherlands have found a negative correlation between imidacloprid concentrations and the abundance of macroinvertebrates in fresh water and the abundance of insectivorous birds. So this occurred even at really, really low levels. So basically, the higher the levels of imidacloprid were, and the lower the abundance and the numbers of macroinvertebrates. They found that this occurred at levels lower than the mean concentration for imidacloprid measured in the UK data that we looked at. And similarly, even very low concentrations of fipronil degrades stream communities in US studies, and they estimated a safe threshold of 4.5 nanograms per litre, which is incredibly low, and it's below the mean concentration in the Environment Agency data. So there are still knowledge gaps around this. We haven't quantified the relative contribution of different sources to the measured pollution. There's good reason to believe that veterinary products are an important source and possibly the main source of the pollution, but this hasn't been quantified. And this is basically what our current research project is working on. So we also don't know all the routes from pets to the environment and the relative importance of these different routes. So bathing has been confirmed as a pathway, but further research is needed to look at other pathways such as pet swimming in waterways, washing of objects that have come into contact with treated pets, such as pet bedding, and washing of owner hands after stroking pets, which is also something that we're currently looking at. And if there's anyone living anywhere near Chipping Norton, we've got a research project running at the moment, so we're recruiting dogs for that study. So if you're anywhere nearby and feel like signing up, please do get in touch. Right, so what can pet owners do? There is a lot of discussion within the veterinary profession at the moment regarding how we should tackle this and what advice we should be giving pet owners. And I would point owners to the British Veterinary Association's policy position statement on the responsible use of parasiticides. The main points that they outline are that we should be moving away from indiscriminate blanket treatment of all pets and towards a more risk-based approach for individual animals. So this would involve taking into account various factors to assess risks such as lifestyle factors and seasonal factors to decide what products we should use and when to use them and what animals to eat. And the idea is to reduce the unnecessary use of these products and to strike a balance which minimizes the harm from parasites, which we do need to take into account, but also minimizing the harm from the products that we use to treat them. And this is just a list of some of the top tips for fleas and ticks that they mention. So they suggest not using topically applied products in animals that are bathed or swim frequently. So you do get newer products which are oral formulations, so coming as tablets. They suggest less frequent or no treatment at lower risk times of year. So winter and early spring are a lower risk time of year for ticks and fleas. They recommend avoiding using multiple ingredient products where they're not necessary. So instead of just treating all the time for worms and fleas in one product, rather treat for worms or fleas. And finally, they suggest considering not using preventive treatment at all, but monitoring and treating it, and if infestation is seen. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Any questions?
Thank you for that, Rose. That was really informative, really interesting, and interesting that Dave Goulson's your supervisor, because my dissertation was actually based on some of his research at university, so it's a familiar name. I've got one of his Bumblebee books somewhere stashed away in my bookcase.
Yeah, it's quite well known.
Yeah. So are there any questions for Rose or myself about the programme? Okay, there's one from Sandy. Is there anything we can bring to local vets to raise awareness? So what do you recommend, Rose? Is that something you can broach with veterinary practices and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I said, there's a lot of discussion within the profession. I mean, one thing I suggest to pet owners is just to raise the subject with their vets. I think just having the discussion, seeing what their views are, and I suppose it helps to make them aware of the issue and helps to make them aware that owners are concerned about this. I think that's an important side of it, an important aspect. Yeah.
Brilliant. Any other questions or queries people have at all? Please speak now or add it to the chat function. Otherwise, we will wrap it up there. If you do have any questions afterwards, I'll be sending an email after this. So you have my email address, so please let me know, and I can always pass on any specific questions to Rose if you think of anything afterwards. So Sandy's mentioned there are a lot of dogs that bathe in one of the rivers in Watford. So I think now it's coming up to summer as well. A lot of people will let their dogs sort of go into rivers and that sort of thing. So I think it is quite a big issue in Watford, and I guess a lot of other local rivers and streams.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a research project going around Hampstead Heath, and one suggestion has been to put up signs. I don't know, you probably need to speak to local councils, but just asking them to not allow the dog to swim if it's been treated with a spot-on product. Yeah.
So yeah, Sandy also mentioned sort of social media. So as promotion for this webinar, I've promoted it quite a lot on social media, but I think it's definitely a good point of having sort of leaflets up in parks, especially where we know the river's quite accessible and that sort of thing. So it's
Yeah,
definitely.
I think it is really something that's, there just isn't really enough awareness of, and my hands are a little bit tied because I have limited what I can say because of, well, my funders, but yeah, I'm hoping with time gradually things seem to be changing, and awareness does seem to be growing. But yeah, I mean, leaflets and social media posts and all of that would definitely be helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think that is it for questions. But thank you everyone for joining. Thank you again, Rose, for presenting. I think it was really interesting, really useful to hear more about that. Myself, I didn't know too much about the sort of, and didn't even really think about the effects of pet medicines in rivers. So it's really good to hear about that, and hopefully then we can raise a bit more awareness in the Watford area specifically as well. But yes, thank you everyone for joining. Hopefully we will see you again soon at an event as part of the Rediscovering of Colne programme. But apart from that, enjoy your bank holiday weekends.